All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out, you guys. I got another short story for you. This story right here actually took place a couple of years ago in July of 2018. And although it's not one of my typical prison gang-based stories that delves off into prison politics, stabbings, and some of the other detrimental effects of that lifestyle, I still thought that some of you might take an interest in it. So this story is basically about an Inglewood gang member that gets all twacked out on Chris. And while he's in this unhinged, frenzied state of paranoia, he allegedly shoots his pregnant girlfriend, two of her friends, and another guy that's supposed to be his best friend. He actually tried to shoot his best friend's old lady too, but the gun ended up jamming up, and as a direct result, her life was ultimately spared. So before I get into the details of this story, let me just say this as it directly relates to this story. So I titled this story Cold-Blooded Paranoia with the subtitle Inglewood Gang Member Smokes Best Friend Off the 710. Because for one, the individual that this story is about was on a meth binge when he committed these crimes. And then obviously because aside from shooting his pregnant girlfriend, he also allegedly shot his best friend off of the 710 freeway as well. You know, addiction is a sad reality that a lot of gang members end up experiencing at some point during their young lives. Unfortunately, it kind of goes hand in hand with the lifestyle. You know, growing up in the streets as a young gang member, a lot of us come from impoverished backgrounds where these things are just part of being out there in the streets. It's almost like it's a staple that's just a normal part of growing up in this lifestyle. Then of course, there's a lot of peer pressure and other things that kind of push us in that direction. It could be from having parents that were dope fiends, having an older brother that you looked up to that used drugs, or even just a circle of friends that we chose to interact with. And all these things become triggers that lead to drug use. So again, addiction is very common within this lifestyle. Coming from a background like this myself and having a serious history of drug usage since the age of 12, I can definitely relate to some of these vices. And I started out drinking and smoking Yeska. They call these the gateway drugs because most of us start out experiencing with these first. Drinking Old English 800, Mickey's, 211, or any other kind of malt liquor. I learned early on what it meant to get a head change. And unfortunately for me, I have one of those addictive type of personalities where it doesn't matter what I do or what I involve myself in, I learned how to maximize it and take it to another level. And drinking and smoking Yeska wasn't any different. When I started drinking at the age of 12, I became a full-blown alcoholic at the age of 12. But like most other young gang members that continue to experiment with hardcore drugs, eventually I got caught up in addiction. And again, for me, 12 was the magic number. By the time I was 13, I had pretty much tried every form of hardcore drug that was out there on the streets. Pills, methadone, PCP, black, Yale, and some of the other drugs that were out there on the streets. You know, when I started experimenting with some of these drugs, some of them were just phases. I would go through a phase, I would try it, and then I would move on. Like I tried PCP and I went through a short phase with it where I was smoking it with the homies, but eventually I stopped because I didn't like it. You know, to this day, I still don't know why people like that feeling. When I used to smoke that shit, I used to feel like my head was gonna pop. What's there to enjoy about running down the street asshole naked or waking up in the hospital strapped down to a gurney because they're scared you're gonna hurt yourself or hurt somebody else? But again, I went through a short phase with it with the homie that I used to kick it with, and then I stopped. The same thing with Yale. In the 80s, I went through a phase where I was shooting Belushis. I was speedballing. A lot of you that are around my age, you guys probably remember, but back in the 80s, that's when they were cutting Yale with ether. Everything was ether based. So it was that rush that you were chasing. As soon as you run it in, you felt it hit you in the chest. Almost like you were getting kicked by a donkey. And that's what they describe as a body high. You lay back and you enjoy that rush. But again, after I went through these short phases, I would always stop and then I'd be done with it. However, the one drug that I would always go back to and that I could never shake was black. Anyways, I said all that to say this. Addiction destroyed everything in my life that I considered to be good. All the things that I valued, whether it was materialistic possessions, some of the relationships I was in, some of the choices that I made, and then of course, it also led to me getting caught up in the criminal element. You know, there's no question about it. Black is definitely a bad drug and it will destroy your life. But the only thing that I can say in defense of using it is that I was at least on some level in control of my mental abilities. Whereas some of the other drugs out there, you're not. I think all drugs are bad, but what I could never understand is why people would want to indulge in any form of drug that completely incapacitates or debilitates your ability to function. Why would anyone want to get loaded on PCP, bath salts, or any of these other recreational drugs that are coming out, where you hallucinate or you're so deep in a fog that you're basically comatose? It just seems crazy to me. So again, the main individual that this story is about, Selvin Salazar, who I'll now refer to as Speedy for the purpose of this story, grew up in Inglewood, California, and comes from a typical gang-affiliated background. According to my source, he comes from a broken family. His dad dipped out on him when they were all real young, and as a result, living with a young, overwhelmed mother who tried her best to provide for him, Speedy and his siblings took to the streets and found the family dynamic in their street gang. So Speedy gravitated to the streets and started hanging around with other young gang members at a young age. His magic number seemed to be around the age of 12 as well. Like most of us that come from similar backgrounds, the age of 12 just seems to be around that time that we got swallowed up by the streets. So he starts drinking beer and smoking weed at around the same time. And he ends up latching on to one of the older gang members from his neighborhood that ended up becoming his criminal mentor. He basically laced him up and taught him how to be a criminal out there on the streets. How to steal cars, how to burglarize houses, commercial burglaries, how to commit robberies, how to sell drugs, etc., etc. And it didn't take long for Speedy to start getting caught up in the juvenile justice system either. So eventually he loses interest in school, he drops out, and then he stops going altogether. And this is when he really started experimenting with hardcore drugs. So he ends up running the entire gamut of what was out there on the streets. Black, acid, sherm, Yale, meth, pills, methadone, etc., etc. He tried them all, but ultimately his drug of choice ended up being meth. And as he got older, he did it more and more frequently. There'd be times where he'd clean up and stay sober for a couple of weeks at a time, but then he'd always relapse and go back on these long binges. And this is when things started getting bad. He'd be up for several days twacked out binging, and after 3 or 4 days without no sleep, he started hallucinating. And this is when he started going on bad paranoia trips. According to my source, who used to party with Speedy and who grew up with him, when Speedy would go on these 3 and 4 day runs, this is when he started getting violent. And this is when he'd end up doing shit that he wouldn't remember. And apparently the paranoia, it got so bad that nobody wanted to be around him. My source said you'd be out partying with him somewhere, and out of nowhere, all of a sudden, he'd accuse you of plotting against him, thinking that you were trying to set him up or that someone was trying to rob him. These were the warning signs that other people that knew him should have been taking notice of. Not just because he was beginning to become unpredictable and becoming a threat as well, but also because of the threat that he was becoming to himself. Again, dealing with the detriments of addiction is one thing, but when you start blanking out or doing shit that you have absolutely no memory of, that's when it's time to stop and get some help. But let's keep it real. When you're out there on the streets and you're ripping and running, the possibility of getting help, going into a program, or having a family that will coordinate an intervention is highly unlikely for most of us. Not only because of the lack of resources or people that will help you do it, but also because most of us wouldn't be receptive to that kind of help, and we'd push back against any kind of help that would materialize. I know I did. There was a lot of people that were trying to reach me when I was young, and I was caught up in that lifestyle. But once I was exposed to the streets, I don't think anybody could have helped me. At that point, I think it was too late. Realistically, the only thing that could have took me out of the streets was for me to hit a bottom. But just think about that for a minute. Can you imagine someone that either binge drinks or binges on some form of hardcore drug like meth, that starts doing shit the night before while they're out there partying, and then the next morning they have absolutely no memory or no concept of what they did? If they're lucky, they'll end up being told about it the following morning while they're at home by either family or a significant other. But just imagine waking up in the county jail after being in a deep meth stupor, binging for 3 or 4 days straight, and having no idea what you did. Then after you ask one of the officers what you did, they end up telling you that you're there for murking 3 individuals and 2 attempted murkings. And then if that wasn't bad enough, they tell you it was on your pregnant girlfriend, 2 of her friends, your best friend, and his old lady. In some respects, this is what happened to Speedy. This became his reality. I can't even imagine how he must have been feeling at that exact minute. He probably felt numb, nauseous, physically sick, and powerless to do anything to help himself. Because think about it, what could he possibly do? Nobody's gonna feel any sympathy for the fact that he was under the influence when he committed these crimes. Nobody's gonna care about that. If anything, it's just gonna make it worse, because they're gonna look at it like this guy didn't just take 3 lives and attempt to take 2 more, but he's also a low-life drug addict as well. You guys know how it is. You guys know how people look at dope fiends, and the courts definitely ain't gonna show no sympathy. So on July 31st, 2018, Speedy was at the Adobe Mobile Home Park on the 1400 block of 135th Street and Budlong Avenue in Gardena, California, where his girlfriend, Anna Ortiz, had been temporarily living. She agreed to stay there with her friends, Olga Pedraza and her longtime girlfriend, Dolores Sanchez, due to the fact that Speedy had gotten abusive and she needed to get away. But even though they were taking a time out, Speedy would occasionally pop up and go over there and visit her. So the Adobe Mobile Home Park is a family-friendly park where there's usually dozens of kids playing in the daytime, riding their bikes, playing ball, or playing with their toys in the open driveway. At night, the park lights up with residents sometimes sitting outside in their lawn chairs, drinking and enjoying the social attributes of just being longtime friendly neighbors. At that time, Speedy and Anna were going through a tumultuous time in their lives, and they were trying to figure out what they were going to do next. Anna was 4 months pregnant with what was going to be their first child together. And like most other young couples, they were experiencing growing pains and financial problems. According to my source, they would fight frequently. They'd break up, then they get back together, then they break up again, then get back together again. But no matter how bad it got, they'd always end up getting back together. But as Speedy slipped deeper into his meth addiction, the fighting became more frequent and it became more intense. From what I was able to gather from my source, it sounded like Anna and Speedy were just at 2 different places in their lives, and their priorities were definitely different. Anna wanted to settle down, she had aspirations to start a family and to eventually get married. Speedy, on the other hand, had no short-term or long-term goals set whatsoever. However, his frequent drug binges and his carefree attitude started exacerbating their problems. Their arguments intensified and eventually it started getting physical. And this became a cycle. When things got bad and it would end up getting to this point, he'd always apologize and he'd tell her that this was the last time, that it would never happen again. But it would, and these promises were always broken. Towards the end, he started pulling all-nighters, and sometimes he wouldn't come home until later on the next day. Anna wanted things to work out, but she despised his drug use. And the only reason she ended up staying with him was because they had a baby on the way. She basically just wanted to keep her family together. She didn't want her baby to come from a broken family like she had herself. On the other hand, she felt like the lies were starting to get played out, and she had a lot of resentment towards Speedy when he'd come home and he'd just sit around all spaced out. So on July 31st, 2018, Speedy had been out the night before on one of his drug binges, and he was all twacked out, hallucinating from the lack of sleep. For the most part, Anna was trying to avoid him that day because she was upset and she had reached a breaking point. They had also talked earlier that morning on the phone, and she had been with him long enough to know when he was high. However, about an hour after they talked on the phone, Speedy showed up unannounced in a black Kia Soul. So his boy, Francisco Montez, who I'll now refer to as Lefty for the purpose of this story, was driving the black Kia, and his girlfriend was riding shotgun. So when these 3 pulled up, Olga, Dolores, and Anna were all standing outside their mobile home, waiting for Olga's brother to show up so that he could fix the speakers in her car. There was either something wrong with her car stereo or she needed her speakers rewired, but whatever it was, he was going to work on her car. So at about the same time that Speedy was getting out of the back seat of the black Kia so that he could talk to his girl Anna, Olga's brother, Seth Pedraza, pulled up behind the black Kia and parked. Keep in mind at this time, Speedy had been up for several days and was on one of his meth binges. So he was hallucinating and he was paranoid. I'm not sure what was said or what set it off, but him and Anna, they started arguing, and from there, it just continued to escalate. So at that point, when Speedy seen Olga's brother, Seth, pull up, he physically grabbed Anna by the hair on the back of her neck, pulled her in close to him, and he told her, "You better not be setting me up or I'm going to smoke them all." Anna responded by saying, "They're not from anywhere, leave them alone." She was basically saying that these guys weren't affiliated with gangs and that they were just her friends. Now, this was undoubtedly paranoia that he was feeling as a direct result from using the nights before. At one point when Anna gets on her phone, Speedy assumes that she's calling rival gang members to pack them out, that she's gonna set them up. And here's the thing, even though Anna and Speedy had been together since the age of 12, they were both from different gangs. She was affiliated with another gang that apparently was rivals with his gang. So that rivalry was something that they had always dealt with throughout their relationship. So again, Speedy assumes that Anna's calling her homeboys to come over there and pack them out, that she's in the process of setting them up. But again, this was all predicated on the paranoia and the come down that he was on. Because Anna, she never called anyone from her gang that morning. And according to what she would later say, she never thought about, considered, or ever planned on setting up the father of her unborn baby to anyone. So again, this is something that Speedy concocted completely on his own, in his own mind, due to the frenzied fog that he was still in. The best thing he probably could have done at that point was to just leave. If he would have just done that, things might have been different today. But he ended up staying, and the longer he stayed there, the more he stewed on it. So Speedy's standing there sweating profusely, thinking that there's a pack of rival gang members that are on their way over there to take him out, all because his girl Anna is setting him up. And the more he looks at her, the more he feels betrayed. So meanwhile, as Dolores is sitting in the passenger seat of her girlfriend Olga's car, talking to her brother Seth, Speedy walks over to the open window and without warning, he opens fire. Dolores is fatally shot and dies within minutes. Seth is also hit several times, but he ends up surviving. Later on, after they ended up taking him to the hospital, they found out that one of the bullets actually severed his spinal cord, which ended up leaving him paralyzed from the neck down. So after shooting Dolores and Seth, Speedy then turns the gun on Anna and shoots her in the neck. After he drops Anna, he motions to his boy Lefty to get in the car, and then they take off. I'm sure his boy Lefty probably knew that he was crashing out, and he probably didn't want to drive him anywhere after the shootings. But I think under the circumstances, he probably went along with it because he knew that in Speedy's state of mind, he was unpredictable. So the three of them leave. They jump into Lefty's black Kia Soul and they head for the freeway. Lefty's driving, his girl's riding shotgun, and Speedy gets in the back seat. So as they're driving, Lefty tried calming Speedy down, as it was obvious that he was getting more turned up as time went on. But then Lefty makes a fatal mistake. Out of concern for Speedy's predicament, he tries to be the voice of reason, and he suggests that he should turn himself in, that things might not be as bad if he turns himself in, that they'll probably cut him a break under the heat of passion, and that it will look better for him. Keep in mind, this guy's still crashing out from the lack of sleep, and by then more time had elapsed, so he's getting worse and he's slipping deeper into the state of paranoia. But this just puts more outlandish thoughts in Speedy's mind. He thinks that his friend is now trying to set him up. So at this point, Speedy tells Lefty and his girl to hand over their cell phones and to just drive him to another one of his friends' houses. But as Lefty turned onto the southbound 710 freeway on-ramp near Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in Linwood, Speedy assumes that Lefty and his girl are trying to take him to the police station to get him arrested. And as this fleeting thought starts to go through his mind, he abruptly tells Lefty to pull the car over. So Lefty pulls the car over while they're still on the on-ramp, and as soon as he puts the car in park, without warning, Speedy domes him in the back of the head. Lefty probably didn't even know what hit him. He died right there on the spot. So after shooting Lefty, Speedy turns the gun on his girl and he tries to shoot her in the head, but the gun ends up jamming. He tries to clear the jam, but this is to no avail. Imagine that. She's just sitting there terrified. She can't move and he's trying to shoot her in the head. He's trying to clear the gun while she's just sitting there watching him. Talk about a guardian angel. Someone was definitely watching over her that day. And she was so terrified she couldn't even make herself run. She just sat there looking down the barrel of this gun, waiting to be shot. So with no other way of taking her out, he just tells her to get out of the car, which she does. And as she's standing there, Speedy drags Lefty's body out of the car and he dumps his body right there on the on-ramp. But Lefty's girl would need that guardian angel to watch over one more time, because as she was squatting down, attempting to tend to Lefty to see whether or not he was still even breathing, Speedy racked the slide back on the gun several more times while pointing it at her head, trying to pull the trigger, trying one last time to clear the jam. Now, considering the gun useless, and probably because he didn't want to get caught with it, he takes the gun and he throws it in some bushes. Then he gets back in the Kia and he pulls back on the 710 freeway. I think it's safe to assume that Speedy didn't plan for any of this to happen, and that this was just the spur of the moment decision that was induced by this meth run that he was on. It was actually a combination of things: the drugs, the argument that he had with Anna, and the paranoia of feeling like he was about to get set up. Even after Speedy committed these murkings, he had no formal plan of what he was going to do. He went to his neighborhood, he went to several of his homeboys' houses, and he basically drove around Inglewood all spaced out, not knowing what to do next. It would be close to 36 hours from the time of the shooting before Speedy would end up getting arrested. I'm sure he was probably tired and he probably felt defeated because he was arrested for making one of the biggest mistakes that you could make in a situation like this. When you're on the run from law enforcement and you know they're looking for you, the last place that you want to go is the first place that you know that they're going to go. To family, known friends, or relatives' houses. Everyone knows this. But again, when you're tired and you've hit a bottom, you start making mistakes and you stop caring. So the investigators that were in charge of investigating this case, they put a surveillance team on Speedy's mom's house, just in case he made the mistake of going over there to see her. She lived on the 4100 block of Century Boulevard in Inglewood. So literally hours after the surveillance team set up their post to watch this location, they observed a black Kia pull up to the house. It pulls up to the house, it parks, and then they see Speedy get out of the car and walk to the front door. And that's when they ended up making the arrest. From there, he was taken to the LA County Jail. And after 6 years, he eventually went to trial for 3 counts of first-degree homicide, 2 counts of attempted homicide, several gang enhancements, a gun allegation, and a litany of other charges. This actually could have been a death penalty case, as they could have charged him with a number of special circumstances. But I think the fact that both the DA and his criminal defense attorney both agreed that he was clearly under the influence of drugs and that he was also in an impaired state of mind when he committed these crimes kind of worked in his favor. But the case was still a slam dunk. They had the weapon with Speedy's prints on it. They had a security surveillance video from the mobile home park. And they had several witnesses that were all willing to testify against him. Some of the most dramatic testimony came from his girlfriend, Anna Ortiz, who by then was the mother of his child. She gave very vivid, explicit descriptions of the shootings, and she was right there when it happened. Olga Pedraza also testified about seeing her longtime girlfriend, Dolores Sanchez, and her brother, Saith Pedraza, both gunned down on that dreadful morning. Her brother Saith, who ended up being a quadriplegic, died 2 years later after being shot due to complications from several surgeries. Lefty's girlfriend also testified about seeing him get shot in the back of the head at point blank range. And then of course she also testified about her own close brush with death and how she only survived because the gun malfunctioned. Several other people also testified, but they were all criminologists, crime scene officers, first responders, gang intel officers, investigators, and other law enforcement personnel. The trial was a rowdy. Speedy's criminal defense attorney, Nancy Sperber, tried to mount a defense by attacking some of the most serious charges, claiming that Speedy couldn't have possibly formed the specific intent needed to convict him of first-degree homicide. But this went nowhere. The judge, a Torrance Superior Court judge named Scott T. Millington, showed Speedy no love. He claimed that in his 20 years of being on the bench, that he rarely seen someone as cold and as callous as Speedy. Someone who could shoot the mother of his unborn child, her friend, her friend's brother, one of his supposed best friends, and attempt to shoot his best friend's girl. For whatever reason, it seemed like they hit a nerve when the judge referred to Lefty as Speedy's best friend, because he became visibly irritated and adamantly denied that the judge didn't know what he was talking about. In fact, Speedy started yelling over the judge and had to be told several times to stop talking, otherwise he was going to be removed from the courtroom. Speedy's exact words verbatim was, "He wasn't my best friend. You don't know what you're talking about." Speedy also prepared a short apology letter that was directed at the family of the victims. But after hearing it, the judge just took this opportunity to take another shot at him. He said, "This has got to be one of the most gruesome, unjust, unjustified cases I've ever seen. These people did absolutely nothing to you. You're not sorry for what you did. You're just sorry that you got caught. You're a cold-blooded killer, and I don't think you should ever be let out of prison." Before I close this up, I just want to leave you guys with some closing thoughts. So when I look at this story and what happened to Speedy, I think that this story should serve as a valuable wake-up call. So when I look at this story and what happened to Speedy, I think this story should serve as a valuable wake-up call of what could happen to anyone who's still struggling with an addiction to meth. A story like this should terrify you if this is still your drug of choice. But not only meth, any kind of mind-altering drug for that matter that leads to you being so mentally impaired that you're no longer in control of the things you do. Now, some of you might remember a story that I told in one of my Inner Demons episodes where I talked about committing a robbery while I was drunk on Cisco and didn't remember any of it. I only found out later after Frisco dumped the case, put me on the Grey Goose, and shipped me off to San Quentin. When I went to screening and got my paperwork from Morrissey a few weeks later, that's when I found out the details of everything that happened. That's dangerous. When you're drinking hard liquor and you're blanking out, you don't remember what you did, or you're indulging in PCP, going on multi-day meth binges like Speedy, or you take some of these new recreational drugs that are hitting the streets, something like this can happen to you. You know, I also talked about this before in one of my other past videos about addiction. But some of these new drugs that have been out for a few years now, drugs like xylazine, have people out there on the streets looking like zombies. In fact, they call it the zombie drug for this reason. You know, I know I'm getting off track, but I think it's important to touch on this because it kind of goes hand in hand with this story. Just hear me out real quick. So xylazine, that's also called tranq because it's an animal tranquilizer, leaves its users with open sores and a disoriented gait. This gait that has skid rows across the nation looking like a bunch of spaced out zombies who are covered with flesh-eating legions. And it's already reached epidemic proportions. You know, I still don't know why this doesn't have more people who are still a part of this lifestyle panicking or feeling terrified that something like this could happen to them. You know, I've driven by spots in San Francisco's Tenderloin District. It's San Francisco's version of Skid Row. And you see people that are out there on this shit standing, but they're bent over like they're touching their toes in a deep nod. Now, I swear, I don't know what's enjoyable about being on something like that. Something that you're not even consciously feeling. But again, it's an epidemic and it's everywhere. You know, the other unfortunate thing about this is that a lot of the cartels or the dealers that are at the top of the chain, they're using drugs like xylazine, iso, and ketamine to cut their product. And this is despite knowing the detrimental effects that some of these drugs are causing. You know, back in the 80s and 90s, at least they used some level of discretion and some degree of morality when it came to what they used to cut their products with. But now, no one cares. That morality today is non-existent. All they care about now is maximizing their profits and making money. And that's crazy, seriously, because knowing that people are gonna physically ingest some of this stuff, they're gonna put it in their bodies. Whether they smoke it, swallow it, snort it, or shoot it, you would think that there would be some measure of discretion or prudence. You know, but people don't care about killing off their clientele anymore. It's not important to them. They're cutting black with black shoe polish or real street tar or other chemical compounds or chemical derivatives that they can find that not only has a similar appearance, but that will also pass the smell test. If they can mix it to where it will give them some extra weight, where it looks good, smells good, and maintains its appearance of what it's supposed to look like, then that's all they care about. They don't care about how it might start dropping people like flies or how it might start eating people's flesh. You know, fentanyl is another one of the worst drugs that we've seen hit the streets since about sometime around 2010. People don't know it, but fentanyl has actually been around since the 1950s. Its analogs just didn't start being illicitly manufactured and mixed with black or sold as counterfeit pills since around 2010. You know, unfortunately, with cutting edge science or the ability that some of these homegrown chemists or cooks have these days, there just seems to be no limit to what they can do. I'm sure that in the next couple of years, we'll see something else new hit the streets that will make fentanyl seem like one of the more tame drugs that's out there on the streets. And it'll be 100 times stronger, and it'll leave behind a swath of dead junkies who all rolled the dice and took a chance shooting it. Anyways, as of November 2024, Selvin Fabian Salazar, who was referred to as Speedy for the purpose of this story, has been housed at Kern Valley State Prison. You know, he's still young and he still has a long, tough road ahead of him. But hopefully someday he'll make amends with some of the people that he hurt. And at least for his own peace of mind, he'll come to terms with some of the mistakes he made himself. If you're wondering whether or not he's active, unfortunately, this is something I can't definitively tell you. However, based on the circumstances of his case alone, without any other political factors, either good or bad, I say it's a 50-50 chance either way. This is pure speculation, but if I had to take an educated guess based on the factual details and the circumstances of his case, I'd say that he was probably in hot water and that he was deemed no good. Not because of the fact that he crashed out and shot 5 people while he was on a good one, but based solely on the fact that he shot his girl, who at that time was carrying his unborn baby. This completely changes the dynamics of how people are going to look at the case. Without shooting this girl while she was pregnant, this case would have been looked at as just another gang member who crashed out and shot 5 people while he was all gouged out coming down off of meth. But because he shot his girl while she was carrying his unborn child, this case is going to fall into the category of some fool who potentially almost murked a baby while he shot his pregnant girlfriend. That one element is going to change the entire case and take precedent over how people look at it. I personally don't think that Speedy was out there on the streets purposely trying to murk women that were carrying unborn babies. I just don't think those were his specific intentions, but he might as well have been, because that's exactly how people are going to look at this case. Unfortunately for him, his case walks the line of falling into that weird case category. I've been around enough Mexican mafia members to know that when it comes to cases like this, they have clear morals, standards, and principles that they follow. They're just as strict as in the Nuestra Familia when it comes to pressing the line and holding those accountable who got it coming. Anyways, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and bring this one to a close so I can get it out to you and get on to the next one. But before I do, let me just bring you guys up to speed with an update on Chewy's condition, since some of you asked. Again, I can't even begin to express the gratitude and appreciation that I have for those of you that stepped up and helped Chewy. No doubt, I got some of the best viewers on YouTube, and you guys are like an extended family. So Chewy, he's still here with me, he's still fighting, and he's trying to be as strong as he can. But it's a day-to-day struggle. I'm still trying to get his insulin regulated because his numbers are too high, and that's been one of the biggest challenges. That and getting him to eat. For those of you that are familiar with diabetes, you have to get your dog to eat in order to administer the insulin. And his appetite has been sketchy. Some days I see flashes of life in him, almost like he thinks he's a puppy again. But those times are far and few. Unfortunately, I see more bad days than good days. And it's obvious that his little body is fighting to get better. I'll keep you guys posted on his progress and how he's doing. Short of a miracle, he'll be on insulin and medications for the rest of his life. But I'm just grateful for every new day that he wakes up and every day that I get to share with him. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and for just continuing to tap into the channel. With that being said, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.